From Bloomberg News and iHeartRadio, it's The Big Take. I'm Wes Kosova. Today, Nigeria's next president has a serious mess to fix.
It is the final lap in the preparations towards the election of Saturday's. Nigerians prepare to go to the polls.
Nigeria's presidential candidates are making their final bids for public support in what is expected to be one of the most closely contested elections in years.
Nigeria's citizens vote for a new president on February 25th, and it's hard to envy the candidate who'll ultimately succeed the current president, Muhammadu Buhari, who's led Nigeria since 2015. The country he'll hand over is in turmoil. Nigeria's public debt is piling up. Inflation is high. There are shortages of gasoline and electricity and even paper currency. Nigeria is Africa's largest economy by far. Its output is twice the size of its 14 West African neighbors combined. And by 2050, it's set to become the third most populous nation on Earth after China and India, with an expected 450 million people. If the government can't turn things around, it will have consequences not just for Nigeria and the region, but the rest of the world too. I asked my Bloomberg colleagues Neil Munshi in Lagos, Nigeria, and Ruth Olurounbi in Abuja, the capital, to talk about the candidates vying to take all this on and the monumental tasks the winner will face. Neil, Nigeria is heading into a presidential election at a time of great upheaval in the country. Can you describe what life is like in Nigeria for the average citizen right now?
It's incredibly difficult. I think some Nigerians would describe it as, the most difficult situation the country has been in decades. The number of out-of-school children is more than any other country in the world, right? 20 million kids didn't go to school last year. The Naira hit an all-time low. Half of adults were unemployed or underemployed. Thousands of young Nigerians are trying to leave the country to go to the UK or Canada or the US because of the lack of job opportunities. And sort of the lifeblood of the economy, which has been for decades crude oil, is letting the country down in a big way. Production has fallen dramatically. The country is not bringing in as much revenue as it needs to.
Nigeria produces a lot of oil, but the revenue from that oil is shockingly small. Why is that?
Most of the revenue over the last couple of years has been eaten up by fuel subsidies. So Nigeria produces a lot of fuel, but doesn't refine almost any at all.
Because they don't have refineries, so they wind up just exporting everything?
Yeah, so there are refineries, but basically they don't function. And they export the crude and then end up buying back expensive refined products like petroleum and diesel and that kind of thing. And then the government subsidizes it so that at the pump, gasoline is one of the cheapest pump prices in the world. And so the government ends up spending $10 billion a year subsidizing fuel, eating up most of its revenues.
If you add the fact that even production is low because of thefts, oil thefts, and so that is also a contributing factor to why Nigeria doesn't make a lot of money from revenue.
How is the oil stolen?
We have the sophisticated ones who steal this oil to export it through the black market, to export to another country and make a lot of money for themselves. Then there are other elements also who do this as well that the government says that is trying to clamp down oil.
So one thing, I just want to add to what Ruth was saying that, last year officials said that a fifth of the country's oil production was stolen from the pipelines, right? So this is like hundreds of thousands of barrels a day being taken out of Nigeria's official production. It's, a massive amount of oil being stolen all the time, essentially. But at the same time as this kind of criminality in the Delta has sort of ramped up and robbed the country of these revenues, this issue of banditry, what's sort of colloquially known in Nigeria as bandits, has come up. And these are basically roving gangs of AK-47 wielding, motorcycle riding men. This issue was sort of isolated to the northwest of the country 5-6 years ago, but has slowly, as the economy has deteriorated, spread across the country. The kinds of kidnappings we're talking about are not just kind of going into villages and kidnapping individuals, but, setting up fake roadblocks on highways and kidnapping entire busloads of people, going to schools with hundreds of children and kidnapping them into the bush for ransom. This is something that affects people up and down the economic sort of chain, as in prominent politicians' relatives have been kidnapped, soldiers, down to sort of ordinary Nigerians commuting kind of thing. And while it was once isolated to the far northwest, it's now the kind of thing that happens all over the country because the government has never been able to get a handle on it, and no one is prosecuted for these crimes. So these kind of gangs have sprung up all over.
And everything that you're describing has also had a terrible effect on Nigeria's entire economy, its ability to service its debt, to borrow money. What is the state of Nigeria's economy overall right now?
It's not great. I was going to say it's in shambles, but I'll just say that it's not great. Like I mentioned earlier, we have increasing inflation that is not subsiding despite central bank's efforts to tame it. We have borrowing that is running high. The IMF said, I think it was last year, that IMF said that Nigeria might spend 100 of its earnings to service its borrowing. Then if your borrowing is increasing, your interest also increases. And if you don't have any money left to develop the country, everything collapses if you're out of money. And then we see investors' confidence in the economy even going down. You see I was talking to an investor the other day, and they're not able to repatriate their funds out of Nigeria because of this currency scarcity, that is the dollar scarcity. So that is also a big problem that Nigeria is facing.
Yeah, so Ruth, you mentioned this currency shortage thing that's happening right now. And this, right now across the country, there are hours-long lines at ATMs and at bank branches to pull out notes, right? Naira notes, because the central bank implemented this sort of plan just over the last 6-7 weeks to replace the high denomination bills. And the rollout was so chaotic that this incredibly cash-intensive economy has sort of like ground to a halt. If you run sort of a Danfo minibus in Lagos, you are now in a position where you can accept old notes, but there aren't enough new notes for customers to pay you with. So those customers are stranded. It's cascading through the economy. And at the same time, and this is sort of in a way, the kind of multidimensional dysfunction that's happening right now. There's fuel shortage. So people are sleeping in their cars overnight at gas stations around the country because they don't have enough fuel to sell. The Nigerian economy is in a really difficult spot right now.
For small businesses, actually, who rely on generators to power their businesses, because there's fuel shortage, there's cash shortages, many of them are closing. And then if you want to buy from the black markets, you buy at maybe 4 times the rate of the official rates, which eats into their profits. And then when you don't even have the money to buy anything in the first place, and you can't withdraw more than 5,000 naira from any ATM point, everything just becomes so hard and so difficult, even for everybody, including the middle class, which is increasingly shrinking now, to the poorest of the people in the country.
Neil and Ruth, you've very vividly described what Nigeria and its people are facing as they head into a presidential election. All of the candidates are promising to fix many of these problems. The current president, Buhari, promised when he was elected to his first term to fix a lot of these problems too, and it didn't quite work out. How much of Nigeria's current situation really can be put at President Buhari's feet?
Buhari took office just before the 2015-2016 oil price crash, right? So he was dealt a pretty bad hand. But many economists argue that the policies that he implemented and stuck to kind of exacerbated Nigeria's problems, so that it was barely recovering from that recession when COVID hit, and it sunk into another recession. And the things that the candidates are promising to do are some of these kind of simple, politically sensitive, sometimes, reforms that the IMF and the World Bank have been sort of, in a way, begging Buhari to do for years. And that is unify the multiple exchange rates, drop some of the import restrictions that he put in place, and cut this costly fuel subsidy. They're all promising to do that in one way or another. But at the same time, in recent weeks, Moody's downgraded the country. And their reason was that despite the promises from these main candidates that they're going to implement these reforms, there are sort of political, structural, institutional constraints that make the ratings agency not believe that it's going to happen as quickly as it needs to.
Our conversation continues after the break. President Buhari has now served 2 terms, so he's term limited by the Constitution. He can't run again. Can you describe who are the candidates now trying to take his place?
Yeah, so Bola Tinubu is the ex-governor of Lagos State, who is the ruling party candidate from the All Progressives Congress. And they run the election infrastructure. And he is, I think most observers probably think he's the front runner. His major sort of opponent is Atiku Abubakar, who's an ex-vice president and a perpetual candidate who is running on the People's Democratic Party, which is the main opposition party, who also has a very good shot. And Peter Obi, an ex-governor, is running under the Labour Party, which is a very small party, has very little in the way of infrastructure or resources, which makes it incredibly hard to win an election in Nigeria.
Ruth, how does the election process work in Nigeria?
So the winning candidate has to secure 25% of votes in at least 26 states. And also, in addition to that, has to get the majority of the votes. And it also has to have the majority of the votes in total. So that it makes predicting who will win a bit complicated.
Peter Obi has been getting a lot of attention in the media. Can you tell us about him?
So Obi, he stands for conservatism in public spending. He wants to limit borrowing as well. Last year, Nigeria spent about almost $10 billion on subsidy payments, and Obi feels this is a waste of money. Everything he stands for actually speaks to majority of the Nigerians who also think that the government is being wasteful in terms of spending, and that the government is not focusing or providing necessary things that the people of the country need to move forward. So Obi seems progressive in terms of providing those things and conservative in terms of government spending. So that makes him very popular with the youth, with the middle class, with the high earners, and also with the people, because he seemed to be he's a businessman, so he seemed to be market friendly, and people associate with that. And the fact that he's an outsider makes him interesting to back as far as young people go. They want somebody that is fresh, with fresh ideas, somebody that can take the economy and revamp it and put it on the right path.
So I have a slightly different take on it in that Obi is younger, but not young, right? He's 62. He is running on a third-party ticket, but that's because he lost the ticket for one of the major parties, right? He was the VP candidate last time around. He was a banker and a governor for many years, right? I think his rise in popularity, which is, as Ruth said, really driven by young people in the country. And, 6 months ago, last year, he could have been dismissed as sort of a social media phenomenon in a way. And what we've seen over the last few months is that it's much more real than that there is kind of a real groundswell of support for him. And I think many observers would say that The reason he's got this support is the frustration that many young Nigerians have with the major parties and their candidates, who are two older men who have been in politics forever, essentially, who've been, leaders of both of their parties for this entire time. Atiku Abubakar from the People's Democratic Party has run in every election since democracy returned, after being the vice president. Bola Tinubu was the governor of Lagos State and has been a national leader of his party. Both of them come with a lot of baggage. And Obi, while not being a sort of true outsider, does represent this kind of third way and has been endowed with a lot of meaning by these young people as a way to sort of change away from the old guard of politics.
Can he win?
He's not going to win. I think he is going to do better than any third-party candidate has ever done, which is something. You know what I mean? It is something, but the institutional kind of constraints are so great. It's sort of, you need a party infrastructure in every state, in every ward, getting people out to vote. And in Nigeria, it is still a fact that vote buying happens everywhere, right? Again, people are very poor in Nigeria, and ultimately the decision that the president makes down the line is not really going to change their lives that much, but 2,000 naira, 5,000 naira on voting day really will. And that kind of thing takes money that the Labour Party doesn't have and the major parties do.
And so you think ultimately the ruling party's candidate will prevail?
I'm a little torn. I don't know, Ruth, what do you think? I'm kind of torn. I had thought for a long time it'd be Tinubu in a walk-off. Now I think with this currency shortage, the fuel shortage, people are kind of fed up with the APC, and Atiku could somehow sneak it out.
Yeah, I agree with that. But if you also, again, to go back to what you said about vote buying at the election, that can give more, because at the last election, I witnessed candidate supporters giving people, say, 5,000 naira, and somebody comes back and says, how much were you giving? And they would tell him, oh, I was giving 5,000 naira. And say, okay, I'll give you 10,000 naira. So it's really hard to call who is going to win this election. It's a matter of who is more desperate, who has the most money.
I just wanted to say, Ruth, as a young Nigerian, how do you feel about this? The trajectory the country's on, the sort of what comes next.
As a young Nigerian who has a kid in Nigeria, it's scary for me. The indices are not painting a good picture. And then, you have strike. We have strike issues because the government is not paying staff salary, lecturer salary on time. So the last time they went on strike was for about eight months. Students were out of school for 8 months. And the wards went on, they're lagging behind. You have this matter of inflation that is eating into your purchasing power. You have electricity issue. I was telling a friend the other day that I saw a 40-year-old article that was talking about fixing electricity in Nigeria. That was a few months before I was born. And I'm talking about electricity issue in Nigeria. I'm talking about not having water, not having these issues. But I will give the three contenders a credit though, because it is in their best interests that the economy improves.
Ruth and Neil, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thanks, Wes.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure.
When we come back, how Nigeria's next president can begin to turn the country around. Which problems should Nigeria's next president try to tackle first? I asked Cheta Nwanze. He's lead partner and head of research at SBM Intelligence. That's a geopolitical consultancy in Nigeria. Cheta, one way that Nigeria has tried to boost its economy is both to get aid from the World Bank and other institutions, and also to attract international investment. And yeah, that's been very difficult. Can you describe those efforts and why they haven't been very successful?
Your average investor is in to make a profit. And very unfortunately, when an investor chooses to take a long-term view, Nigeria generally, except for a very few sectors, has not been very good in terms of return for investment. And a lot of this is because politics gets in the way of everything. And because of that, it prevents certain kinds of investors from coming to put down money in an economy where they know that getting on the wrong side of someone in power could mean that they lose their investments. And you have so many different competing interests. I tend not to like the narrative when they say, oh, Nigeria is a country of 250 tribes. And the reason that I don't like that is because a tribe is a very small group. So I'm from the Igbo-speaking part of Nigeria, so my historical nation would be the Igbo nation. There are probably 30 to 40 million Igbo people. There are only maybe about 5 million, 6 million people from Croatia. And you call Croatia a nation, but you call the Igbo people a tribe. It doesn't work that way. Nigeria, like most African countries, is a country of very many nations who have competing interests. And these interests, we need to learn how to compromise. So unfortunately, because of our history of military dictatorship, we learned how to try to push things through by force. We've been a democracy for 24 years now. So we are still in the process of learning how to negotiate and reach compromises. And again, it's a messy process.
Another big problem that Nigeria faces is enormous debt. Nigeria pays a lot of money just to service its debt. How can Nigeria overcome that? What is the way to grow the economy in a way that can turn that around?
The government needs to get off its backside and do the work of bringing in the large formal economy into the taxation bracket. When you look at Nigeria's GDP figures, you'll see that the oil industry contributes about 8.9%, somewhere between 8 and 9% of Nigeria's GDP. However, when you look at government revenues, the oil industry contributes somewhere, depending on which point in time you're looking at, somewhere between 85 and 94% to government revenues. That's an anomaly. You have a lot of other parts of the economy that contribute more to the economy than the oil industry, but the government is so laser focused on oil that it leaves every other thing. So what that means is that we are taking on a lot of debt. A lot of incidents have happened outside Nigeria's control that essentially means that the country is not generating as much from the oil industry anymore. Yet we are still taking on debt because at the end of the day, the government has commitments. There's a large civil service that needs to be paid. There are the security services, they need to be paid, and those are just the basic things. So they're taking on loans and basically kicking the can down the road.
Those in charge of Nigeria's government have made promises to make things better, some of them along the lines you're describing, and yet things have arguably only gotten worse. When you look ahead, what do you see for the future of the country? Are you optimistic that Nigeria can make things better?
I think that there's a lot of pain that we need to go through in order to set us aright. Consider Nigeria to be like a huge oil tanker that needs to turn around. To turn it, you need somebody very strong to turn the wheel. So think of an oil tanker on the Suez Canal. There will be a lot of pain in making that turn. But when that turn is successfully done, then in the long term, Nigeria's prospects are very good. So the key thing is, how do we manage that period of pain?
Cheta Nwanze, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to us here at The Big Take. It's a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us questions or comments to bigtake@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is Vicky Vergolina. Our senior producer is Catherine Fink. Federica Romagnello is our producer. Our associate producer is Zenib Siddiqui. Hilda Garcia is our engineer. Our original music was composed by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back tomorrow with another Big Take.